While everybody's coming on in, if you will, go ahead and open your songbook to number 678. 678. Brother Joe's going to lead us in that song. After that, Paul, if you don't mind, would you word our prayer for us, please?
Sing praises to your name, to acknowledge the greatness that you are as our Creator. As we open the Bible this morning, we hope that we can learn something new from your Word, something that can be applied to our lives to help us to shine our lights as Christians, help us better understand you and those things that we study. As we study, may we open our hearts and minds and focus on what we're looking at in Christ's name.
Amen.
Well, if you will, go ahead and open your Bibles now to the book of Acts, to chapter 26. We'll begin our study at verse 27. And I will remind you sort of where we are. I do get people who comment on our classes who are watching us online. And sometimes they'll say we've had to skip a couple of weeks, but we like you catching us up. So Acts 26, Paul is before Festus and Agrippa. Agrippa has come, and Festus has invited him to help him listen to Paul. And Paul has presented himself and his teaching prior to Agrippa. And Agrippa is a different man, for instance, than Festus. What was the difference between Festus and Agrippa with regards to knowledge? I'm trying to get you in the flow of commenting now. Okay. Agrippa had a history of interaction and ruling over the Jewish people. And he knew them very well. Now, Festus had only an acquaintance with them. And so here you have a man by the name of Agrippa who's listening to Paul, and we get to verse 27, and Paul says, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do believe. Now notice the key word there is believe. What did Agrippa believe? Did he believe the Old Testament? Yes. Did he believe what the prophets had written was true? Yes. And so he says, do you believe the prophets? I know you believe. Then you get to verse 28, Agrippa's response. Then Agrippa said to Paul, you almost persuade me to become a Christian. This is probably one of the most debated verses in the book of Acts. And the reason is we don't know the tone of voice in which Agrippa responded. Now, the King James and the New King James leave it with, you almost persuade me to become a Christian. In other words, I am almost to the point of believing what you're telling me, Paul. Then there are other translations that leave it with the idea, do you think with such little persuasion that you could persuade me to become a Christian? In other words, sort of sarcastically. Now, if we could have heard the tone of voice which Agrippa used, we might could be able to know for certain. But we don't know for certain. I'm going to tell you my opinion, and my opinion is the way the King James and the New King James present it, and that is, you almost persuaded me to become a Christian. And you can say, well, why do you have that opinion? Is because of verse 27. Do you believe the prophets? What does Paul say? I know that you believe. So he is trying to say, Agrippa, this is what I am presenting to you. And I think Paul's response to it in verse 29 will also reinforce that view. But if I heard Agrippa say, do you think you could persuade me to become a Christian with so little, then I could understand that as well. But my opinion is that the way it's presented here makes more sense in the context. Well, let's go ahead and take verse 29 with it. And Paul said, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me today might become almost, and altogether such as I am, except these chains. Now notice with me, if you will here, he says, Paul is saying to Agrippa, he said, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me might become both, almost, and altogether. The reason that I said, I believe verse 28 indicates almost you persuade me to become a Christian is notice Paul's response to it. What is his response? We wish that everyone would not just be almost, but altogether. That seems to indicate that it's almost like you're here, but you're not quite there yet. I've had a number of Bible studies with people that we've gotten to a point where they're just almost ready to become a Christian, but there's something that's holding them back. And, you wish could remove that out of the way so they'd all together become a Christian. That's a hard thing. And Paul is saying, I would that you were all, not only almost, but all together such as I am. That you believe what I believe. He said, except these chains. He says, I'm not wanting you to be in chains, but I want you to believe what I believe. I'm trying to persuade you of that. And so Agrippa now has heard this message. And then verse 30, when he had said these things, the king stood up, as well as the governor and Bernice and those who sat with them. So they've heard the message. Is it likely sometimes that when you present a message that people will be moved, but not completely? Do you remember Felix? And he says, when Felix heard what Paul had presented about righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come, the Bible says Felix was terrified. He was afraid. He said, when I have a convenient season, I'll call for you. I think there are times when people get very, very close, but there's something standing in the way. And people who are often in that position of almost, but not quite, what do they want to do? Look at the verse 30 here. They want to run away from the position they're in. Okay, let's stand up. Let's go ahead and stop this now. So they stand up. Now, what we find in verses 31 and 32, and when they had gone aside, they talked among themselves, saying, this man is doing nothing deserving of death or chains. Then Agrippa said to Festus, this man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. Now, this is the 5th time that Paul has been found innocent. He's done nothing deserving of death. In fact, this man could be set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. Now, here's an interesting question that someone raised in one of the commentaries. He said they had gone aside, they talked among themselves. How does Luke know what they said? Inspiration's one answer. Or Luke was close enough to hear them? Okay. there's a very good possibility that they come back out and they say to Paul, Paul, had you not appealed to Caesar, we could have dismissed your case and set you on your way. We've conferred, and this is what we've concluded. So it's very possible that what Luke is doing is reflecting what they had discussed in private and that they had revealed in public. So it's possible inspiration, but here Paul could have been set free had he not appealed to Caesar. When you appeal to Caesar, you don't retract that. This is not something that is a minor thing. It's something that you be reserved for a life or death situation. And so now, having appealed to Caesar, Festus still has to deal with this matter of sending Paul to appear before Caesar. The only reason why he had asked Agrippa is because he wanted to have something to write. And what's he going to write now? After this consultation with Agrippa, what's he going to write? Okay. He's going to say, I don't know what this man did. I don't think he's deserving of death, but he's appealed to Caesar, and so to Caesar he's going to have to go. Now that leads us through chapter 26. Paul, he appealed before Festus is when he made his appeal. But had Paul not appealed, what would have happened? They would have taken him back to Jerusalem and he would have been killed, which is what the plan was. And so appealing to Caesar was his only option to save his life. So, and I think it's also part of God's plan because that was God's way to get Paul to Rome. Okay, let's go to chapter 27 because chapter 27 just picks right up at the end of chapter 26 and what's going to take place. And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. Notice it was decided that we should sail to Italy. Why is it going to go to Italy? That's where Caesar is located. And so what they do, they take Paul and it says some other prisoners, and they put them under the care of a centurion named Julius. Julius was a very popular Roman name, and so we don't know which one he was. We do know that he's a part of the Augustan regiment. What does that mean? Okay. Our court system is tiered. You understand, like you have your local, then you have your state, and then you have your federal. And for instance, if you are, for instance, a part of an incarceration in the state, but your charges against you are federal charges, who is going to take charge of transporting you to where you're supposed to be? Federal marshals, not your state, not your county, not your city. It's going to be federal marshals. So if he's going to be transported, he's going to be transported by somebody who is a part of the Augustan regiment. In other words, we're talking about here people who are part of this, we would call it the federal. They're the empire-wide. So these are not your local governor's people, nor are they Jewish. These are your people who are a part of that, and that would indicate a position that you are now very responsible and very important. And have centurions been good men in the Bible? Honorable men. They're professionals. They're your soldiers. And so they're a part of these people here who are traveling. We get to verse 2. Yes, and I meant to bring that out. I'm glad you did. It decided that that Luke picks up with his we passages again because prior to this, in fact, you go back to chapter 21 and verse 8 with the last of the we passages. So Luke's now a part of this. He's traveling with them as they're going to Rome. Okay, let's pick up with verse 2. So entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, the Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. Now, two or three things here that I think just are matters of detail. He said the ship of Adramyttium. I'm going to show you where that's at, but that's a place where ships docked, and it's actually across from the island of Lesbos. When we went to Assos in 2013, we drove right by Adramyttium, and while we were driving from Pergamum there, and it's, like I said, it's a seaport, and it was one of the places where that ship would originate. Do you know that many of the cruise ships where their, I guess you'd say their home area is, what country? Anybody know? No, Bahamas. Most of the ships that sail here in the United States, their home base is the Bahamas. And so if you get on a cruise ship, for instance, in Miami or Jacksonville or New Orleans, you're probably going to get on a Bahamian ship. That's why they do that. But it's, I guess the point I'm trying to make is he's putting on a ship of Adramyttium. So that's a ship that's going to be going that direction. It's going to sail along the coast of Asia. And, sometimes when you're reading along, you may not realize the detail of all this, but why would they sail along the coast? Same reason why, but cruise ships, many times go straight across the water. But what about airplanes? Have y'all ever noticed that airplanes mostly fly over land? You know why, don't you? Safety. They have to have an emergency landing. There's generally an airport not too far that they can get from. If you're flying, like for instance, if you fly from, say, Atlanta, Georgia to Athens, Greece, you know the direction you're going to go? You're not going to just fly straight across the Atlantic Ocean. Well, you don't go to the North Pole, but you go up the East Coast over New York, then you go over Nova Scotia, you go over Greenland, Iceland, then you come back down over like England, and then you'll go over to Switzerland, but you fly mostly over land. And the reason why you do that is because if you had a problem with your plane, what can you do? You can land. Well, ships would sail near the coast, especially if there was difficulty, and especially if the ship was not incredibly large. Now, the third thing that he tells us is that one of his traveling companions is a man by the name of Aristarchus. You can go back to Acts chapter 19 and verse 29, and he's one of Paul's traveling companions from Ephesus, or who was seized at Ephesus. In Acts chapter 20 and verse 4, he went with Paul all the way to Jerusalem. Colossians 4 verse 10 tells us that he was one of Paul's close men. Now, the reason why all of this is important is because I believe he's one of the men who was traveling with the money that Paul had raised. And so here's this man, he's going backwards, but how long has he been gone from home? 2 years, at least, because Paul, you remember, was arrested, and he went through the end of Felix's administration into the Festus governorship. And so for 2 years, Paul was there. So evidently, Aristarchus has stayed here with Paul. Now, that's going to come into play here in just a moment. Now, give you some kind of idea of, if you'll look right down here in this area, there's Caesarea where Paul began in the lower corner, right down here. He is going to sail, notice, to Sidon first. Then they're going to come up in this area of Pamphylia, Cilicia, Pamphylia. They're going to go to Myra. Now, here is the ship of Adramyttium. That's where Adramyttium is from. And evidently, Paul's going to change ships right here in Myra. This ship's probably going to go on this way, but Paul's going to get on another ship when he gets to Myra. Now, again, you can see the blue line that goes here, and then the red line that shows that Paul made a different change. Okay, let's look at verse 3 now. And the next day we landed at Sidon, which, by the way, was 69 miles to the north. And Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. So if Paul stops at these ports, why would you stop at ports? Eat lunch? Well, I'm sure they carried lunch with them. Loading and unloading supplies, pick up people, drop off people. It's like, for instance, if you're flying on an airplane, you're going to make connections in, this city and that city. You'll have some people get off the plane. You'll have some people get on the plane. And there may be cargo that's on the airplane as well. That's because that's our primary transportation. But that's what they're doing. They're stopping at Sidon. But while they're here, it says that Julius gave Paul liberty to go to his friends and receive care. What does that tell you about Paul as a prisoner? Okay, he's trusted. He's not your normal prisoner, because if you were transporting a criminal as a federal marshal and you got to an airport and you say, okay, you just go to the food court and eat all you want and I'll see you when you get back on the plane. It wouldn't work like that. And that's because that's not common. But Paul had earned a reputation while he was at Caesarea, had he not? Did they know he was an innocent man? Yes, he did. Was Paul such an honorable man that if Paul said, I'll be back, he would be back? So Paul here is a man who was given liberty to go and be with his friends. Verse 4, when we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. Notice we put to sea. Well, I thought they were on the sea. The word sea here indicates deep waters. It's one thing to be near the shore, but now they put out into deep waters, and they sailed under the shelter of Cyprus. What do you mean under the shelter? Okay. As 2 or 3 said at one time, there's a protection from the wind. The wind is going to be coming from a direction that if you don't have a land as a shelter, then it would be incredibly intense. And so they said we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus. Now, when I think of the word under, what do you think? You tend to think south, but it's not south. It's going to be actually to the north. But he says because the winds were contrary. If you're going to try to sail and the winds are going the opposite direction, what's going to happen to you? You're going to have a hard time going. So what you find here is, it says, and when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. Now, here's a little larger map to give you some kind of idea. They're going to go up the coast here. I'll use green here. They're going to go from Caesarea to Sidon. They're going to go up, and then this area right here to the north, I guess that's not a good color to use. Maybe I'll use yellow. This area right in here between Cyprus, that's where the winds was blocking. So if the winds were coming like this right here, and they'd tried to go on this side of Cyprus, what would have happened to them? It'd have pushed them backwards, made it more difficult to. And by the way, that was the way that the winds often would come. And so they come around and they come, and this is the area here of Cilicia. This right here is Cilicia, and this right here is Pamphylia. You remember when Paul went to Perga of Pamphylia, which is right here. So as you're looking at all of this, they sail to Myra. And so then they're going to change ships here in Myra. It says there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. Now, later on, we're going to find out this ship has almost 300 people on board. Over 200 people on board. Is that a pretty good sized ship? Especially when if it's an Alexandrian ship, most likely it contained grain. So, and they're going to talk about later about throwing the wheat overboard and the tackle overboard. So This is a large ship that Paul is on. The first ship was a ship of Adramyttium, likely a smaller ship, but it was big enough to carry passengers. But now this is a much larger ship, and so the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy. That tells us where it's going. So it's almost like if you're flying a plane to one location, and when you get there, you're going to have a different destination. So then you get on another plane to go to where you're wanting to go. So the centurion put them on board and to sail toward Italy. Now, again, here's where we're at Myra. And so they're going to go. And again, you would think they would just go this way right here. But there's a reason they don't go that way. And we're going to follow the green line here, again, sailing close to the sea, or close to the land. It says, when we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off for Salmone. Now, if you'll notice here, it says there's with difficulty, the wind not permitting. What's the problem that Paul or the ships are having during this period of time? Headwinds. And it's tough to sail. Today we get on ships and they are mostly maneuvered by what? What makes the ships go? Engines do. And so they may have to face into the winds, but they've got engines large enough to be able to overcome that. But if you were a sailing ship, and which was the way that most of them, if the winds are blowing the wrong direction, you're going to sail slowly. And notice Paul says, or Luke says, many days. So it's not a short journey. This is really a slow thing. And so now they're going to sail under the shelter of Crete off Salmone. Now, again, here's another picture. Here's where Crete is. Here's where they left from. And but he says, we're going to sail under it. Now so here is Salmone right here on the right-hand side of your screen. And so they're going to come onto the south side here. And that's what Luke's trying to describe for us. They're going to come to Fair Havens, which is near Lasea. Then they're going to go near Cauda, which is an island, because they wanted to go to Phoenix. So let's keep reading here. And again, they're planning on going from there further. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. And so again, you come right here, and I'm actually fixing to show you a picture. When we went in 2013, we went to a city called Heracleon, which is right on the north side. And in the background, you're going to see this mountain right here. And right there is that mountain. So we're on the north side, and you can see that mountain if you're on the south side. So on the other side of that mountain is right where Paul was when they were sailing and coming through there. And by the way, going back to that picture there, I don't know if you can tell, the waves are pretty strong. I started to put a video on there to show you how strong the winds were. Everybody who had umbrellas was standing there trying to hold them because it was raining, and it just turned their umbrellas inside out. I mean, it was really, really strong winds during that period of time. Now, when much time had been spent and sailing was dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them. Now, I want to stop here before I go into verse 10, where the sentence continues. He said, much time had been spent. We've already been told that it's taken many days. This journey is not going the way that they would like for it to go. What's the problem? You're facing these headwinds. The headwinds, it's taking a lot of time. And now it's gotten to be dangerous because the fast is already passed. Now, what that tells us is here in verse 9 is that this is likely somewhere around the 1st of October. And from October to March, they do not sail through the seas. And I remember in our trip in 2013, our trip was the 1st of March, and I asked, I said, can we sail back in February? Oh, no, we don't do that. In fact, our ship was the first one that had sailed during the season. And I wish we'd waited a week or two later because the winds were terrible while we were there as well. And the ship was just constantly doing this. I remember the door to the bathroom of our room, the door would just sling open and close, because it was just, the waves were so strong. When you got off the boat, you were doing like this right here because you were just, I really felt for Brother Garland Robinson. He ate Dramamine like they were candy. I mean, he was just nauseated the whole time we were on the ship. And it was tough. But what you have here is the fast is already over. And so Paul advised them, saying, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo in the ship, but also our lives." When Paul says this, has Paul been a man who's traveled frequently? Yes. Does he have experience not only with travel, but does he have information, spiritually speaking, from God? And so he says, this voyage is going to end in disaster, and so what we need to do is we need to harbor here. Now, there's a reason why they don't want to harbor there. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than the thing spoken by Paul. Here's an interesting thing. This ship, this Alexandrian ship, has a helmsman. What does a helmsman do? He's the pilot, He's the guy, we would call him, he's the captain of the ship. He's the one who's directing it. But he says also the owner of the ship. What does that tell you also about who's on the boat? You got the person, if the owner of the ship is persuading, he's got to be on the boat. Because if Paul, if this centurion is talking, he don't have a cell phone and say, "Can I speak to the owner of the boat here in Alexandria?" If he's speaking to the owner of the ship, where has he got to be? On the ship. He's got to be right there. So they would often travel with their ships. And so the centurion is having to make a decision. Do we get off here and let these people sail on, or do we stay on the ship? And Paul has said, "I'd advise you not to go ahead." And the centurion says, "Well, what do you say, helmsman?" Helmsman said, "We can do it." Owner of the ship, what does he say? "We're going on." And so the centurion says, "Okay, we're going to listen to those men rather than Paul." Now there's an additional thing. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete opening toward the southwest and northwest, and enter there. Now the island of Crete is 150 miles long. You understand, getting your idea? And you got Salmone on the east side, you've got Fair Havens in the middle, and you got Phoenix on the far west side. So if we could just sail about another 75 miles, we'll be all right. We can harbor there in Phoenix. Well, that makes good sense, doesn't it? Not looking back, it doesn't. Well, what we read, if you'll notice here, again, to give you some kind of idea, here's where they're at, and Paul is trying his best to persuade them not to go on. But they're saying, "Well, surely we can make it to Phoenix." I mean, for them, that makes good sense. And that's a good harbor there for them to winter, because there was not a place to harbor, a good winter harbor there. Well, when the south wind blew softly, supposing they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. Now, notice the wind is blowing, south wind's blowing softly. It's not a strong wind. Okay, Paul, you just didn't know what you were talking about. So they think they've got everything going, so they put out to the sea. They get out in the deep water, and they sail close by Crete. They kept the land in their sights. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon. Notice now, not long after that soft wind, it says a tempestuous headwind. What would that seem like? Tempestuous headwind. A storm. Not just a storm, but a strong, strong wind came up. And so it's called a Euroclydon. Now, what's interesting is that is a combination of a Greek word and a Latin word. It's a made-up word. It's a term which they had, like for instance, if it comes a big rain in Alabama, they call it a gully washer. I don't know if that's a Tennessee term or not, but that's what, in Alabama, if it's a big rain, they call it a gully washer. That's a term. A what? A frog strangler. I didn't know you could strangle frogs, but but anyway, this is the word carries with it the idea of a southwest wind raising mighty waves. That's the meaning of the term. A southwest wind. Okay, if it's coming from the south and the west, and you're trying to sail south and west, what's going to happen? You're not going to go very well. And it's a headwind. Well, you get to verse 15. So when the ship was caught, and we could not head into the wind, we let her drive. The ship's out in this water now, out in the deep water. You can't go back the direction you want to go. What option do you have? You just turn it loose and let it go where it's going to go. And so they let her drive. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, or Cauda, some drop the L, we secured the skiff with difficulty. The winds are blowing so strongly, they have got a skiff. What's a skiff? It's a lifeboat, small boat. He said, we secured it with great difficulty. That tells me that the ship's doing this right here, and they're trying to get it on board so that they won't lose it. And he said, we did that with great difficulty. And so here you notice now, instead of them going like this right here, they have been blown off course, and they've gone under this island of Cauda. And it says when they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing that they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, then they struck sail and so were driven. The Syrtis sands are the northern coast of Africa. And there's some area where the water gets very shallow, and it's real sandy soil. And you know what happens if the ship gets in that? It's stuck. And you may be miles and miles from land, but your ship's stuck. What would that do to you? You're stranded in an area where there's nothing but water around. And so they were driven. Well, I would say they struck sail that they actually tried to grab a hold of the wind to go, so they avoided the sands there. Unless they're too strong coming at you. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. On the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Now, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. Notice they didn't see the sun and the stars for many days. What does that tell you about the sky? cloudy. I would say stormy. You know, it's a situation where the tempest is beating on us. The storm is just coming and they're not getting out of it. And it says all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. How does everybody think this is going to end? We're all going to die. We're going to drown. But after a long abstinence from food, then Paul stood up in the midst of them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and did not sail from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss." Paul gets up and said, "I told you so." But notice, it's after a long abstinence of food. They still have food on board because they're going to throw some of it over. But what's happening here is that they feel like, you know, that they're, I wouldn't say they're seasick. I would say they're soul sick. They're afraid that they're going to die. And so they're not interested in eating food. But Paul is standing up in the midst of them. And it says, "And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship." Do you suppose they're willing to listen to Paul now after Paul had warned them about what was going to happen? And the owner and the helmsman said, "Oh yeah, we can do it." Now they're like, well, maybe we better listen to Paul. They also know he's a religious man as well. "For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you.'" Was that a welcome message? Absolutely. So Paul made it clear this was a revelation from God. "Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me." This is one of those red star verses in your Bible. He says, "I believe God that it will be just as it was told me." What is that? Biblical faith. When you believe just what God tells you and you believe it's just like, that's biblical faith. Paul said that's what we're going to do. "However, we must run aground on a certain island." Does Paul know how this is going to end? Where it's going to end? Yes, he does. "Now, when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land." Notice, how long has this thing been going on? 2 weeks. Not eating any food, not knowing what was going to happen, being driven up and down. I've been on some rough seas, but I knew after a day or two I was getting off that boat. But can you imagine being on it for 2 weeks like that? Day and night. So it says they were driven up and down. They knew they were going north and south, but they sensed that they were near some land. How do sailors sense that? Sound? Birds possibly? Smell of the land? Also probably the way the waves react. Do waves react differently when they're out in the open ocean than the way when they are near land? They raise up because of the current going under it. So they sensed they were drawing near to some land. And notice it's about midnight. Would that be a challenge at midnight? It would be. So they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they took sounding again and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest they should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. Interesting detail here. They prayed for day to come. There may be people say, well, we don't pray much. They're praying now. They're praying that day would arrive. They're afraid they're going to run into the rocks. And this. That's where they are. They're south of Sicily. That's the Adriatic Sea. Okay, and as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship when they had let the skiff down into the sea under the pretense of putting out the anchors on the prow or from the prow, you see what's going to happen. Some of them say, okay, we're getting close to land. We're afraid this big ship's not going to make it, so what are they going to do? They're going to get into the lifeboat. And they're acting like, well, we're going to go put out some more anchors on the front. Guess what's going to happen? No, it's not going to work. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. There's a sermon in verse 31. Unless you stay in the ship, you can't be saved. I got 2 minutes, so unless you stay in the church, you can't be saved. I'll just drop it there. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. And as the day was about to dawn, Paul implored them to all take food, saying, today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eat nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from your head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread, gave thanks to God in the presence of them all, and when he had broken it, he began to eat. Does Paul have their attention, of the people who are on this ship? Are they listening to him? Absolutely they are. And so what they are doing now is Paul had them ready to eat. Now this is, I see Kirk coming, so what we're going to do, we're going to leave Paul right here with them having their last meal before the ship is going to break up and before they end up on the island of Malta. So Lord willing, next week we're going to finish the book of Acts. And so we'll pick up there next week.